This presentation is to talk you through how to write the long essay for the American History Advanced Placement Exam. This is a new type of exam for 2015, and here is the question that we're going to write on today. How were the lives of farmers in the second half of the 19th century affected by technological developments and government actions? So when you get a question like this where you have basically two parts, technological developments and government actions that you're being asked about, the first step that you should take before you begin to write is to take a few minutes and plan. So that's what we're going to look at next. So we gather our information about farming in the late 19th century, information that has to do with the two subtopics, technology and government actions. And this is the information that I gathered from our American Pageant textbook, and it is a little bit disorganized as far as the topics, but that's okay. We're going to get it organized when we begin to write. The Homestead Act of 1862, as we've learned about, it allowed a settler to acquire as much as 160 acres. You could live on it for 5 years, improve it, and pay only a nominal fee of about $30 or $1.25 an acre. Families moved west in large numbers. They hoped for the opportunity to become successful farmers, but dry soil in the plains made it quite difficult. So different farming practices were adopted, such as dry farming, the practice of using shallow cultivation, and this worked for a little while, but eventually depleted and dried the soil. The farmers also switched to tougher strains of wheat, and they did call for and ask for federally financed irrigation projects, but these would come much later than the 1890s. Other parts of the essay that we are going to add in. During the Depression of the 1870s, farmers protested against railroaders who ran the farmers into bankruptcy by charging as much for a short haul as a long haul. Many Midwestern legislatures tried to regulate the railroads, such as in Illinois, but the Supreme Court did not support this. In the case Wabash versus Illinois, they said that only the federal government could regulate interstate commerce. The government did step in and pass the Interstate Commerce Act, which did several things to control railroads, prohibited rebates, pools, required railroads to publish rates openly, forbade unfair discrimination against shippers, outlawed charging more for a short trip than for a long trip. High prices also during these depressions caused farmers to concentrate on growing, or before the depression, caused farmers to want to grow single cash crops such as wheat or corn. And mechanization even fueled this desire to have a big farm even more, because with the machines, farmers could do more with less labor. These machines were the combine, reaper, and harvester. Then when the depression struck in the 1870s and 90s, farmers were further hurt when deflation, poor soil, droughts would cause the prices of their crops to drop, and many farmers lost their land to the banks. Farmers sold their produce sometimes in an unprotected world market, and they had to suffer from the tariff, which was quite high in our American market. Because our tariffs were high, other countries would raise their tariffs, and farmers could not sell their products overseas because the countries had a high tariff on an American import. Also, farmers were at the mercy of the trusts, the harvester trust, barbed wire, fertilizer, and railroad trusts, who could control prices and keep them high against a poor farmer. Last of all, farmers would try and organize, starting with the grain to the patrons of husbandry. They began to make co-ops and to cooperatively buy supplies. This means that they could get those supplies at lower prices because they could buy in bulk. They also had places for storing their crops. They also bought those. Some grangers entered politics and tried to make laws that were favorable to farmers, but courts would immediately reverse their laws. Farmers also formed the Farmers Alliance, which would later become the Populist or the People's Party. They continued their cooperative buying and tried to gain control over railroads and manufacturers. Eventually, the populace would call for many reforms that would be favorable to farmers, nationalizing or controlling the railroads, telephones and telegraph, a graduated income tax, and new federal sub-treasury in which harvested crops would be stored until prices rose. Populace also wanted free and unlimited coinage of silver to get more money in the markets where they could buy and sell more easily. So those are the sets of information that we would be using when we get ready to write this long essay. Please always remember to include periodization in your paragraphs. We've talked about that. We put those examples at the last part of the paragraph. Periodization is when you give an example, has the same causes usually as the topic, and it occurred before and after the topic that you are on. You can get 2 points for that. If you only do before or after, you get 1 point. Synthesis. Well, 3 ways to get synthesis in the essay. You can write a statement that links to the thesis, explain the effects on another type of history like social, economical, political, racial, gender, or connect to another event in history that is similar but may not have the exact same causes. So now I'm going to read through the essay that I wrote in which I used the information that I gathered, and I'm going to stop periodically and note the thesis, the statements in the paragraphs that connect to the thesis, examples of periodization, specific factual information, and also periodization. This is the introduction of the essay. The late 19th century was a time of dramatic change for most Americans. The rising power of the capitalists, along with industrialization, drew more people to the cities than ever. Farm life was changing quickly as well. Government policies and mechanization created new ways of life for farmers that were easier in some ways, but more challenging in others. So my thesis does extend or modify the actual question. It goes beyond it by talking not just about technology, but it refers specifically to mechanization, and it also refers to government policies, and that some of these policies and mechanizations created some easier ways of life, but also some more challenging ones. Here's my first body paragraph. The first sentence relates directly to the thesis. During the Civil War, the U.S. government sought to settle the West quickly, but farming on the plains would be unlike the traditional method. Then I go into my specific factual information to talk about settling the West quickly with the Homestead Act of 1862, that it drew settlers to the West. I then go into changes in farming that occurred when people moved west, the challenges due to weather, drought, flood, plagues, harsh winter, the dry farming methods that were used, and the new crops, new strains of wheat that were tougher and could endure the harsh weather. I then refer to mechanization, combine, harvester, reaper, that would help farmers do more with less labor. I then talked about how these new machines allowed farmers to buy more land because they could farm more land with less people. They mortgaged their land to increase farm sizes, and farmers sometimes switched to a one-crop system, hoping to sell their product east on the railroad to a wider market. However, sometimes disaster struck, weather and panics, economic hard times, but I don't talk about those until later in detail. I do talk about here the depressions, such as the ones in 1873 and 93. Farmers would become even more vulnerable as farm prices plummeted. This paragraph continues with farmers then trying to sell their products overseas, and they're subject to buying wars, and the high tariff rates kept them from being able to compete with other foreign competition. Nations also raised their tariffs when we raised ours, and that farmers were at the mercy of several different trusts. So throughout this paragraph, I have used italics for the specific factual information as I've talked about it, And then at the end of the paragraph, I include my periodization and the synthesis statements. So in bold, here's an example of periodization. No matter which direction the farmers turned, they seemed destined to face hardship, just as the indentured servants in Virginia prior to Shays' Rebellion. I then show a connection to the thesis with a synthesis statement. Even though mechanization had made life easier for farmers, every other entity made life harder for them. And this synthesis statement does help me connect to my next paragraph, in which I'm going to talk about government and what little government did to help make the farmers' lives easier. Second body paragraph. By the late 1800s, farmers were desperate for help, and they looked to the government for regulation, but little help came. This is an underlined statement that connects to my thesis directly. I then talk about Illinois and the efforts to regulate the railroads, that the Supreme Court struck down the laws to regulate railroads with Wabash versus Illinois. I then go into how the government did create the Interstate Commerce Commission and what it did. I then go on to talk about how the Interstate Commerce Commission was a good help to the farmers. However, farmers still needed more. They organized in parties such as the National Grange of the Patrons of Husbandry, and what those organizations did with the collective buying, and then the other organizations such as the Farmers Alliance. I do talk about how the courts came out and reversed the laws that the Grangers passed. To continue this paragraph, I talk about the development of the People's Party, or the Populist, and the reforms that they desired that would help the farmers. I also then go into how these populists are much like some of the reform parties in the past and in the present. And this is how I get my periodization in. I compare them to the Whig Party, which was a reform party for internal improvements in a bank, and then the Tea Party calling for reforms in fiscal policy today. My synthesis statement: farmers would have to pull together in large numbers to sway policymakers more than ever. Since the election of 1896 is the last one to cater to farmers. Just after this election, Congress raised the tariff to its highest level yet in order to protect business over farming. So I'll go into a little bit of political history here and to help connect to the thesis and to remind the reader that we talked about how this period in the 1890s there were some good things that happened for farmers. However, there were many challenges that were coming to them, and that the government was not necessarily doing very much anymore to help those farmers out. Here's my conclusion. The late 1800s was a challenging and difficult time for farmers. Though they organized for the first time and gained some government protection from railroad trusts with the Interstate Commerce Act, they would continue to have their voice heard. They would struggle to have their voice heard above the growing power of businessmen. They would also struggle to gain needed reforms at a time when the problems of city life were detailed daily in the yellow press. So I hope this review helped you all learn how to write the long essay, how to quickly brainstorm for information according to your parts of your question, how you plan for periodization and synthesis, how you are careful to make sure that you, at the end of your paragraphs, that you add in your synthesis and periodization to get those extra points, and also that you have a thesis that you carry throughout your essay in those topic sentences.